Welcome to another episode of the Distributed Data Show, brought to you by DataStax Academy, where we bring you the latest news and interview technical experts to help you succeed at building large-scale distributed systems.
Now, Adron, you had touched on earlier, I mean, it's not what we're doing, but you had touched on earlier about some other potential paths, like whether you're talking VPNs or some other things there.
Right. So there are companies and other providers of connectivity between clouds where you basically get a dedicated pipe where it's point to point between the clouds versus bouncing out to the public internet and then back in and doing all that kind of stuff. And also, like, sometimes they can assist with, for instance, bandwidth cost. And a good example, just like if you're used to AWS and their direct connect technology, whenever you connect that and you're going from data center to data center or whatever, it drops your costs a little bit on your data moving back across the pipe. It gives you a little bit lower price cut there just because it's making it more streamlined versus anything going out and then back in. So as far as securing all of that, though, at the cloud level or the cloud provider level, I think that the first things that you want to look at is just like what certifications does the cloud provider offer? What is the transparency level around how they secure, like, everything from their data centers to, you know, the data between the data centers and things like that. So the certifications come into play a lot there. And then as you start to look at, well, does our application need Sarbanes-Oxley or some certifications, you know, those types of things, see where the providers line up there. Maybe some of them support exactly what you need. Right. And maybe some don't, and that might disqualify them. But
that's an excellent point.
Yeah, it's because, I mean, it's what's the term? I'm going to mess it up, but like lowest common denominator is your highest level of security, right? So like if somebody has, you know, SOC 2 or whatever, and then another provider does not, that means you don't have it, right? Because you don't know where exactly your data may be if it's a true, honest to goodness distributed setup with good, you know, reliability and everything. So that's a big concern when you're looking at all that stuff. It's like, make sure they have the certifications that you need for whatever your application is doing. And then also, just from, I mean, my own nerdy perspective is I want to know exactly what are the hops that are going to happen between any clouds. Like, I want to know exactly where my traffic is going. So, and it's for the fact of, I want to be able to secure it, but I also want to know, like, why is my throughput spiked in this situation, but not in this situation? Like, is my traffic on my West 1 location going to, like, New Zealand and then back over to New York for the East location? I mean, what kind of nonsense could be happening? You don't know sometimes until you really dig into it. So you kind of got to dig in and do some, you know, some lookups and figure out where your traffic is actually heading, you know, and make sure that you fix any issues that might be coming up too.
And to that, you know, that's a really great point. And to that, like, I almost wonder, you know, if you think about it, especially in our particular case, since we are deploying a data center in each one of the cloud providers, right? People with Cassandra today, right, deploy huge clusters that are spanned over all sorts of regions with DCs all over the place, right? And I'd be really curious. I mean, now mind you, I think you could make an assumption that if I'm talking a single provider, that hopefully with the example that Adron just gave a second ago, that wouldn't be a case if I'm going from US East to US West or something where it's jumping over to New Zealand or something. But I wonder, is the latency that different? Is the latency really that different? If I actually have, let's take that case. Let's say I had a cluster, one provider, and I had regions, and I'm going to say in this case, 2 DCs, and I had one data center over in the east and one data center over the west. What does that latency look like? How many hops are there, and that kind of deal? How different is that really than if I'm on AWS, GCP, and Azure, but I'm all in the same maybe general area or something? If I am, like, is it that much different? Right. So I
think that sounds like a great experiment to go along with our research. I think that's really something interesting to consider.
I'm always curious about the geographically oriented solutions for stuff too, because I know, like, between, I believe it's AWS and Azure both have a data center in Frankfurt. So that's the same city. So like if I had two, you know, multi-cloud options there, and I needed to implement something across that, I would want to make sure that, why am I not using city fiber to connect those 2 points? I know it's there. That's what I want. I want the most awesome capabilities I can get. So, I would want to look into that and see how I could connect the providers in that geographic location.
Right.
Just like way out on the Northwest, there's the Dow's data centers, which AWS has one, Azure has one, Facebook has one. There's a whole bunch of them down there because of the hydropower resources that make it very efficient. And all of it is sitting on fiber. So, if you're going multi-cloud, figure that out and see how you can actually connect those providers. There's usually some very, very powerful options there.
I just read an article actually just this morning, and it said essentially exactly what Aiden is saying, which is when you're thinking about multi-cloud, it was talking about some considerations that you need to make. And it said, always know what everything is doing, which I mean, it's a little bit, it's a little high level, it's a little tongue in cheek, but it's exactly what you're saying. And right, you have to really research it and really follow how this is going through. And right, if there's fiber there, but is it actually going through the fiber? And if it's not, if it's not, then you need to know that. You can't just make assumptions just based on what I think this is that. You got to test it out, and you got to try it, you got to see, you got to time it, right? Yeah.
I guess that goes back to other conversations we routinely have too, which is test, and then test some more.
And so another thing that's come to mind here with the deployment, I'm actually totally switching gears. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Totally switching gears though. Unless there's something else on the on this particular part of it.
You're increasing the suspense here. So now I'm very curious.
Do you like this? Oh no! Now do I have to say something profound?
Yes.
Right? Do I have to really?
Thought have you gone off on? What switch did you change tracks on here?
That's funny. Well, I was just thinking about things from a standpoint of looking at the deployment of things, and I'm going back to like the KillrVideo standpoint, and some of the other things that we had to take into consideration. And I was actually surprised once we got the SSL part taken care of and we started talking to the cluster, that part was actually that wasn't that hard, right? But I was actually surprised at...
I guess we should say for our application.
For our application,
it
yes,
wasn't
thank
that
you.
hard.
Well, yeah. No, and again, that's a good point. That's very true. We already had the framework in place to make that part easy.
Right.
Right. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. No. Very true. Very true. No. It just goes back to the cluster standpoint of it and the operations of that. One of the things that I thought was really neat. I mentioned this earlier about when we actually deployed the cluster initially, and we could provision it with LCM.
Right.
That this to me is just cool. Is that with OpsCenter, I can look at my cluster regardless of the cloud provider and where those DCs are in a totally homogeneous way. Yeah. So the nodes, if you were to look at what's going on, if you were to look at the DCs I have, you would not, other than the labels, right, and maybe the IPs that they have and stuff like that, you wouldn't know that they were deployed in different clouds.
Unless you're really looking to find it.
Yeah, right. I mean, exactly. Unless you're really looking to go for that. So from that standpoint, from the operations standpoint, that was something I thought that was really neat. I'm like, because when I first saw it, when it first all went up and everything like that, I'm like, that's totally cool. Because like I am now, it almost seems, I feel like I'm going to oversell myself on this, but I get really emphatic about these things. It almost seemed like I was like, well, it was like so easy or so obvious that I almost forgot that I had this cluster deployed on 3 different cloud providers.
Right. And it brings up something.
Yeah.
This is a best practice, or should be a best practice. Make sure you label and identify where these things actually are. You don't want to you don't want to
That's a great point.
where your stuff is. Yeah.
So that way when those nodes go down, hopefully they won't, but if they do, you can pinpoint to what's going on with different cloud providers, and it's a quick and easier fix than just not knowing anything. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so anyway, so that part of it was just really neat because from the operations standpoint, when using the tools provided, it didn't look any different.
It was seamless.
Yes. Yeah, so that part was neat. It was the same thing. Now, this actually gets into a whole nother avenue because we really haven't talked about why would someone do this? Why would you really do this, right? We haven't really talked about those use cases. Now, in our particular case, right, we are essentially allowing the application to connect to any one of the nodes, right, that is distributed over these multiple DCs. But in all reality, would I really do that? Right? Would I really do that? And matter of fact, I mean, one of the things we've talked about is to make this even more real. Like right now, okay, I got a single web app, right? Single web app in some provider somewhere, it doesn't matter. And then that's going to connect to this cluster. And well, okay, if I want to make this truly seamless, right, do I need to maybe put a global load balancer in between the app and the actual cluster? If I want to do this, if there's a reason, if I have a use case to actually have multiple cloud providers all providing essentially the same data, right? My replication factor is such, I'm just replicating it across all my DCs. So if there was some reason that I wanted to do that, I need to ensure my web app can get to any one of those because if one of my providers, let's just go into the extreme, right? Bam. I'm not trying to pick on any provider, but
well, just provider A, right?
Yeah, provider A. There you go. Thank you. That was the way to do it. Yeah, provider A just goes down. Right. That could be. I mean, if you want to go for like this ultra resiliency thing, but we could argue whether or not that makes sense. But at some point, my application, there needs to be something there that it can correctly route to where it needs to go. Because if I just connect it directly to one of those and it doesn't have any way to route to the other ones, it goes, provider A goes away, then the app is not going to have a database, right?
You're in a similar boat, right? I mean, it's better because you have now the replication across, but you're going to have to, you have downtime.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Which is the whole point, right? You don't
downtime.
You don't want that,
right?
So that. Oh, go ahead, Adron.
Well, this is a prime example, and some people may remember this, but it was quite comical. Let's just say provider A doesn't renew their SSL certification, so then you can't get to it. So if you have the load balancer there, then you can't get to the other ones. So you have to be cognizant of where you're going to put your load balancers. And your load balancers also need their respective redundancy, and the name servers also need their respective redundancy. It's just like an incident about a year ago. If you have just your list of primary name servers and then that name server is unreachable for whatever reason, and you don't have the appropriate failover, then the name server system doesn't work for you and your stuff can't communicate on the internet. So have your redundant name servers, have your respective load balancers that can fail over or act both at the same time, and then, serve as they're available. So when one goes down, the other one continues to work. But the redundancy has to be matched by respective redundancy.
Yeah, and then, I mean, so one of the things that we're, from our application standpoint right now, going back to the whole use case thing, one of the things we're kind of exploring with all this are, well, what are those particular use cases, right? Now, I'm thinking back to something that I've done at previous companies, right? That would not apply to this particular need with KillrVideo, but let's say, for example, you have clients or you have some type of existence in Canada, and maybe there are laws that prevent the Canadian data from being in U.S. servers or something like that, right? But let's say provider A does not provide to Canada. Let's say but provider B does, right? That might be a reason why you need to do that. Now, someone could argue, well, wait a minute, you just talked about replicating your data across all of these. But if you need to cordon off this data here, then why would you do that?
The exact opposite of what you're saying.
Yeah, so really what it comes down to is, again, for what we were doing and what we're exploring, that makes sense from that standpoint. But there are all sorts of other use cases that come into play, right? Yeah. So in that case, you might actually have another cluster on a different provider or something like that. You might have data in different places. And the cool thing, though, is then from the multi-cloud standpoint, you can support that. Right, and it's actually pretty easy to be flexible and move from one to the other. Right. And as Adron kind of, as he was alluding to as well, I mean, we've seen it in the news lately. Yeah. We have seen cases where all of a sudden a particular provider is getting into the space of one of their clients, and that client doesn't want anything to do with it, and they're like, nope. And they need to be able to move. I mean, I came from a previous organization. Now, mind you, this was moving from on-prem into the cloud, but like my experience, especially when you have an entrenched application with years of data, and
Right.
you know, depending on how big it is and such, it doesn't take a week to move this stuff.
No.
Right? Like, I mean, and
Even separate from
At
the
least
technology.
two. At least
yeah,
two.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this stuff takes months or
Yes,
years. Now,
absolutely.
from the technology standpoint, right, when you were talking Cassandra, we know from a replication standpoint that stuff can be managed. But I'm not talking from the tech standpoint. I'm talking politically, from bureaucracy, from all of the things that have to happen to get people in line to move that kind of stuff.
Right.
That stuff takes time.
Right. The other apps
You know-
that rely on those that may have to
Yeah.
make changes that, right, absolutely.
Beyond the bureaucracy too of just the company, there's the bureaucracy of the laws that one has to meet, such as GDPR is one that's probably familiar in everyone's mind right now. But like IP, you can't track that stuff in analytics data, like web analytics data in Europe, because it's considered PII. Right? In the US, though, you can track people in all sorts of weird, creepy ways. But in European Union, you can't. So, and then there's the flip of it too. Like if you do in some way find a reason and you get a permission from the user, et cetera, and you have that information, it still has to be geographically located in that country or whatever. And then just like the Patriot Act introduces some interesting complexities too, because if we have data in a distributed system that's multi-cloud, let's say in EU and the US, what access Germany has versus the US to that data in legal situations can completely be very troublesome at very high levels. So some additional thoughts on, well, where are we putting our data? You know, if we go multi-cloud, where do those data centers exist? What implications does that have for our data and our database? Like, what happens if, Romania decides that they don't want to have their data anywhere else in the world? They go in and they take the servers out of the data center, right?
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden, so does that mean part of your data center just disappeared from the overall cluster?
Right.
So there's a lot of interesting aspects to be concerned about outside of just, technologically, like you were saying, and all those types of things too. I did
applies anywhere.
Yeah, it really does. I did also notice too that there's certain things going on. I got to look into the law or whatever it was exactly with stuff being stored in Canada versus the U.S. I think it has to do with some of the same things like GDPR type of privacy stuff or whatever. But one of the big providers, I'll say provider A, just released new data center access and the ability to like subnet out and break out stuff within their Canadian offerings. So like there's a big push to really make sure that access and data centers are located in all the places that you need them when you go multi-cloud. So
yeah, and one thing I wanted to add into that was, as I mentioned a moment ago, like everything that Adrian's talking about right now, right? These are things that, regardless if you're talking a Cassandra database, if you're talking Oracle, if you're talking MySQL, if you're talking not just the database, but from application, these things have to be handled for anybody who has the need to be in these different geographic locations, right? Now, the thing from the Cassandra standpoint, because I'm totally biased when it comes to Cassandra, obviously, but from the Cassandra standpoint, I think one of the things that is really powerful and awesome, right, is at least from the database standpoint, the ability to replicate data out into other data centers within my cluster that or even create other clusters, but the inherent ability to do that is a huge difference. Because I mean, I'm thinking about cases in the past where not using Cassandra, right? Where trying to replicate all of the stuff into other regions on other clouds, it was very daunting. I'm not saying that it's all perfect and shiny happy rainbows and everything, but it's much, much, much easier.
This is all by design.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cassandra was created with all of these things already considered. It was really ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And now here, the time is here. The time is now.
The time is come.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I had to do that. It was just there.
So we talked about, I think it's really interesting how our conversation has kind of gone. We kind of talked about the easy in the beginning. Right, the deploying of the instances. Well, that's that has its own challenges. Don't get me wrong, but we talked about deploying the instances on the different providers. That's more or less pretty easy. Once you kind of get the hang of it, you're good to go. Deploying DSE, it sounds ridiculously easy, seamless. That part was easy.
It's the step
application.
1 parts.
Yeah.
Those are the easy parts, but then after that, it's a whole new world.
It's exactly. So I think, in our conversation kind of went to the more difficult things that aren't necessarily straight tech related, but there's a lot of challenges and a lot of things that need to be thought through from a larger sense, and then the smaller sense, just you there with your code, your application, you got to really think about all these little things. So I really like how we kind of went easy to difficult. So.
Yeah, and if you go, I'm not suggesting to do it this way, but as we were getting built up and we started with a rudimentary system, once you solve some of the stuff, figuring out how you're going to provision your various instances and that kind of deal. When it came to deploying the node with a single CA certification and hooking up SSL and making that work, so taking what we had, our working real reference app and making it work like that, that part really wasn't all that hard. Now that again is rudimentary. We've talked about that, right?
Yeah.
It's basic security, it's basic stuff, but it's cool because you can literally, and we've done it many times. I mean, as we're testing this thing, we deploy a whole new cluster to those 3 providers. Once you have the basic stuff in place in like 10 minutes. Yeah. So that's, there's parts in there that are really nice, but you need that initial setup.
Every once in a while, though, I do like to talk to some of the members of the community that have been around and remember acquisition, attainment of hardware, installation of hardware, and placing all this out there, because it's so interesting to hear the stories of what minutes that used to take months, maybe years.
Yeah.
And then we talk about the bureaucracy we have now. Even that is easy to do.
That's a really great point.
Whatever was going on then, yeah.
I think this is a really exciting time. It's a really exciting time for this team, and I think it's just a really exciting time for all lovers of technology. It's a really cool time.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah. Well, I think that takes us. That gets us wrapped up. So thank you for joining us. We enjoyed talking about this together, and we hope to continue the conversation. So comment and let's keep talking about it. Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us again for the Distributed Data Show. We love your feedback, so go to the Distributed Data Show page on DataStax Academy and tell us what you think. You can also find us on the DataStax Academy YouTube channel or find our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get great podcasts. While you're there, make sure and subscribe so you don't miss a single episode.